Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is psychic functioning and the brain, and we're privileged to be with neuropsychiatrist Dr. Vernon Neppe, the head of the Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute in Seattle. Dr. Neppe is author of several books, including a series on déjà vu, also Cry, the Beloved Mind, and Reality Begins with Consciousness. Welcome, Vernon.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
When we think about psychic functioning in the brain, it seems to me there are two contradictory components that we have to look at. And one is, how does the human brain play a role in the functioning of actual, legitimate parapsychological experiences on the one hand, and on the other hand, don't these experiences point to the notion that consciousness functions outside of the brain or independent of the brain somehow?
It's a very difficult question, Jeff, and the answer is not easy. But I think there are a few answers in relation to this. I think the major component we ought to look at is the fact that the end point expression is an expression in the brain in us living, sentient beings. So we are living, we are sentient, we are experiencing phenomena in the brain.
And we're verbalizing.
And we're verbalizing, and we're thinking, and we're emoting, and we have volition. And clearly, these are all components of brain function. The whole question that you're really asking is there something more than just inside the brain? Are these so-called psi phenomena that are happening, are they arising from inside the brain or outside the brain? Are they linked up with our current concepts of time and space? Are they local? Or are they linked up with concepts beyond that time and space? Are they non-local? Or are they both? Or are they relatively non-local? So all of these are questions that one has to answer. And you used the term psychic functioning, and of course that word psychic is used in many different senses.
Yes.
Some will use it in the sense of this being a psi phenomenon, such as extrasensory perception or psychokinesis, the incoming afferent loop and the outcoming efferent loop. Some will use that word psychic in terms of the anguish of the mind, the angor anima, the psychic component, as opposed to the somatic or bodily component, for example, of anxiety. So in this sense, we're looking at it in the context of what is subjective for us as, in the psychic sense, the paranormal or psi experience sense, and this is how a lot of my work has been linked up in terms of brain and consciousness.
Well, and I'm a parapsychologist, so that's my main interest, but we do need to acknowledge that the word psyche, it really relates to the soul, and there's so many overlays of theological and depth psychological thought regarding the psyche.
Exactly this. And this is very much why it becomes so complicated. And the other complicated area is, if you look at it, you have neurology and the neurologic side of what goes on. And in that neurologic side, you, at the end of it all, have synapses and nerve cells, neurons, and you have connections. And this is how we could argue all of our functioning goes on.
Yes.
But we also have psychology. And there would be the reductionistic side of psychology that says, oh, well, those psychological functionings never mind psychic functionings, are all just part of those brain and that network. Or maybe there is a different kind, a different level of consciousness, a different system of way of thinking in terms of psychological functioning, which is a little bit different.
Philosophers have been debating these questions for centuries.
Exactly. And philosophers, at the end of it all, are busy saying, wait a minute, what about that consciousness that maybe comes about outside the brain? In fact, maybe we don't even have a brain, maybe we don't even exist. Maybe it is all imaginary and it's all a psychological construct pertaining to our own individual identity. So they have been debating it.
Yes.
But I'm introducing this in the context of a third fabric of consciousness, as opposed to the psychological and the neurological, which some might say is the same, and some might say is subtly different, that there are psychological functions that you cannot fully attribute to the brain. The third one being, therefore, this outside consciousness. And I actually just, from a completeness sake point of view, but very, very important, at the most basic level, in terms of existence, is the quantum. And one could argue that maybe there is even a kind of consciousness linked up with that quantum. And this has been some work we've been doing on a phenomenon or on a third component called Gimel. But let's get back to the brain.
Let's get back to the brain. You are a neurologist and a psychiatrist. Most members of your profession subscribe to the standard materialistic model, which would say that every kind of human consciousness is, strictly speaking, a product of the brain. But I think it's important to note that some of the most prominent members of your profession, people like Sir John Eccles and Wilder Penfield, have disagreed with that conventional notion. And you also disagree with it.
Yes, and of course, one cannot just say one disagrees, because there are relative areas of disagreement, and sometimes certain aspects are very much and fundamentally linked up and possibly contained within the brain, within that endpoint expression. But certainly Sir Wilder Penfield had a remarkable component in terms of being a neurosurgeon who would stimulate various parts of the brain while these people were awake. Because, for example, if you're doing epilepsy surgery, you certainly don't want them asleep and to chop out the wrong part of the brain. You want to see what you're evoking. And at times, he was surprised. Like when a patient said, I'm outside my body. I've left my body. And this was, from the descriptive point of view, an out-of-body experience, which conventional neurology would then say, hold on. You see, it's all in the brain. And there have been several different times when one's been able to find an out-of-body experience by touching or stimulating different parts of the brain. And you can do the same with déjà vu. And the problem is that sometimes it's not the same part of the brain. So when you stimulate one area of the brain, sometimes you might evoke this feeling, I've been here before. And other times you might just evoke a specific memory. And other times you don't evoke anything, and yet you stimulate an area of the brain a little different. And you do evoke similar kinds of phenomena. And you say, hold on, what's going on here? But certainly when you talk about Wilder Penfield, a preeminent neurosurgeon, you have this possibility that, maybe there's more. And Sir John Eccles, certainly marvelous in terms of his own reputation. Awareness that maybe there is not a one-on-one correspondence of what is conscious with what is in the brain. And so this was one of the areas of research I tried to look at.
Both of these great neurologists were philosophical dualists.
Yeah. And I, incidentally, am a unified monist. I'm not a philosophical dualist.
Right.
In other words, I don't separate out the brain from that consciousness, but it doesn't mean to say that I'm saying there's no consciousness outside the brain. I see all of existence as a single phenomenon.
Now, you have written quite a bit about the temporal lobe of the brain and how it does seem to play a role in psychic functioning.
Exactly that. It's a most fascinating area because you can compose a series of questions pertaining to the different kinds of symptoms that you have relating to the temporal lobe of the brain. Now, we know about those symptoms because of clinical experience, which is very, very important. We must not diminish down our clinical experience and our experience with patients with temporal lobe epilepsy as opposed to other kinds of epilepsy, or with non-epileptic but abnormalities of functioning of the temporal lobe of the brain, non-epileptic temporal lobe dysfunction. But we also know these symptoms because we can stimulate, boom, 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 different areas of the brain and know what is evoked. Now, it might be a little different with each person in the exact anatomical positioning, but to a large degree, it's similar enough to know what symptoms are linked up with the temporal lobe of the brain. Now, the problem was that nobody had phenomenologically categorized this. They had to look at what were the symptoms and what would be relevant. And so I started to do this and developed a series of questionnaires, the first imaginatively called the Neppe Temporal Lobe Questionnaire. And later on, over time, it developed into a whole series of different adaptations by different scientists, such as Dr. Persinger. And the major component I have now is one called the INSET, or Inventory of Neppe of Symptoms of Epilepsy and the Temporal Lobe, the INSET. Now, the reason why this is important is you can get patients and ordinary individuals, and maybe subjective paranormal experience, those so-called psychics we were talking about, to answer questions pertaining to the kinds of symptoms that they have.
Yes.
And you can look at the current frequency and you can look at the past. And from this, you can build up a picture of, for example, do people with subjective paranormal experiences have more temporal lobe kinds of symptoms than ordinary people? I shouldn't say ordinary, let's say non-experienced people who don't have these experiences. The reason why I say I shouldn't say ordinary is these people, these so-called psychics, these subjective paranormal experience, are very often ordinary people. They have no pathology. They have no abnormalities prevalent in the temporal lobe of the brain, except that when you start looking at them, compared with a control group of non-experience, they have far, far more. And I'm not talking about, well, when you analyze it, they have 53% compared with 47%. I'm talking statistics that become overwhelmingly significant, even when you look at 6 or 8 in each group. This is how powerful the data is.
Well, let's talk for a moment about what does it mean to have an active temporal lobe?
Okay, the temporal lobe of the brain is the great integrator. So we all have a temporal lobe of our brain, and we all integrate information. So polymodal perceptual input, in other words, from every source, from touching, and from smelling, and from hearing, and from seeing, and from tasting. And some of the other thoughts that are coming through, and even feedback from areas of the body that we don't even know where this comes from. All of them have all these link-ups ultimately to this massive right and left temporal lobe of the brain with all sorts of little components linked up. And so linked up with the temporal lobe of the brain is the whole limbic system, the whole emotional system, and memory systems in terms of registration of events and recall and the ability to retain these bits of information. So it's the polymodal perceptual input, the great integrator of the brain, and we think, and this was my hypothesis, that if psi phenomena were real, they would have to be integrated through the temporal lobe of the brain as well. So that's the integrator, as opposed to, for example, like the frontal lobe of the brain, which would be the executive, the motor component, the component of activity.
The decision maker.
The decision maker. And in that context, we have psychokinesis, potentially PK, in terms of manipulation at a motoric level, and maybe this is more linked up with the frontal lobe of the brain, and I hypothesized that, and Bill Roll hypothesized. But we move back to the temporal lobe of the brain because this is very, very fertile. So now, when they go wrong, any of these kinds of symptoms can occur and can go wrong, and sometimes they go very wrong. So we might have people having active seizure phenomena relating to temporal lobe absences, for example, and obviously you've got to treat it. And you might have explosive phenomena, uncontrolled rage within firing going on probably in the mesial temporal lobe of the brain. Or you might have distortions, because you can stimulate things in terms of, for example, the lateral, the sides, or the superior parts in terms of the top parts of the temporal lobe, and produce all sorts of distortions. Now let's phenomenologically classify them and say, what happens to these ordinary people, these subjective paranormal experience, when you compare it with a group of non-experience? And this I was able to do initially.
Yes.
And I was able to do this by saying, let me take the whole population of people who have an interest in so-called psi phenomena, in ESP, in PK, extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, in intuition. Enough interest to have joined a group like the Society for Psychical Research. In this instance, it was a group of people from the South African Society for Psychical Research initially. And I said, I'll take that whole population, every single member. We nagged them. We made sure that every single one of them responded.
To your questionnaire.
To our questionnaire. But initially we just had some screening questions. We wanted to really sort out those who had these experiences compared with those who did not have the experiences.
Yes.
And in fact, we then clustered it and defined how detailed these experiences had to be, and introduced criteria for veridicality, in other words, truth. So some kind of objective component. I spoke to my friend about it. I wrote about it. I did this, that, the other.
As opposed to fantasy.
As opposed to the fantasy, and as opposed to somebody who is just imagining it or is psychotic. So we had two very nice groups.
Yes.
We did, incidentally, EEGs and them, electroencephalograms, but which is another side of it, incidentally, some earlier work and some work that were incorporated within this. Temporal lobe of the brain showed up in trance mediums more, but it hasn't been well replicated all the time. But in any event, so this way we were able to look at these two groups, and strange enough, it was easier to find in that population people with large numbers of different kinds of subjective paranormal experiences, out-of-body experiences, healing, intuitions, precognition, psychokinetic skills, seeing auras, even maybe mediumship. And these were compared using a whole series of questionnaires, which are called the Subjective Paranormal Experience Questionnaires, and they went deeper and deeper and deeper. We compared this group with those who had never had any experiences, the non-experience. And then we gave them a temporal lobe questionnaire. And wonder of wonders, people with subjective paranormal experiences, again, overwhelmingly, we're not talking about slight amounts, overwhelmingly had far more, what I use the term, anomalous temporal lobe functioning than those who don't.
Now, anomalous temporal lobe functioning could mean many different things.
Exactly that. And I wanted to make sure that I was using the term anomalous so that these people would not be labeled as having temporal lobe epilepsy. They would not be labeled as being abnormal because they have different kinds of symptoms linked up with the temporal lobe. In other words, you've got to be very careful in terms of description, in terms of phenomenology. So they had these different kinds of symptoms despite being normal.
What I gather you're saying is more volatility in the temporal lobe.
Well, you know, I used the phrase, the window into the mind. If there is something outside, we spoke about maybe an outside kind of consciousness. You see, in our little world of 3 dimensions of space and a moment in time, there's no way we're talking about outside consciousness. Everything's there in the brain, and if we have a little bit of a dream, we try and even explain that within the brain. It might be that there are other dimensions of consciousness. There are other ways of perceiving and experiencing reality that comes outside. Could it be that this temporal lobe of the brain is the window into the mind? And if this is so, could we do it in reverse direction? Could we take a group of people with temporal lobe epilepsy or with temporal lobe dysfunction and look at their temporal lobe symptoms and then look at their so-called subjective paranormal experiences? Do these people have more psychic experiences than people who do not have temporal lobe epilepsy, other forms of epilepsy, or comparison groups of people with abnormal brain functioning in some other way, or of psychiatric patients? Could it be that they are special both ways round? Now, this is very important because if you look at the practice of medicine, this is what we do all the time. A person has symptoms. They are urinating too much, they're drinking too much, they may be losing some weight, they're getting fatigued. And we say, wait a minute, you have symptoms of diabetes. And we list out the different kinds of symptoms of diabetes. On the other hand, we could do a blood test. And we could say, wait a minute, this blood test says you have diabetes. And so the question is establishing causality. And if you can establish it bidirectionally, both ways, people with these kinds of symptoms are likely to have this high-level blood test, for example, what's called a hemoglobin A1C. Or people with a high hemoglobin A1C are likely to have these symptoms of diabetes. This is bidirectional, and this establishes a good causal link. So this is what we tried to do with our work on the temporal lobe. So you will remember here in South Africa, I was able to show temporal lobe of the brain, possible temporal lobe symptoms, higher amount, not necessarily abnormal, doesn't matter. You know, I came across this sense of a smell of perfume. This is not going to affect you in any kind of way, although it might be hallucinatory. Higher amount of these temporal lobe symptoms in the subjective paranormal experience compared with the non-experience at a highly statistically significant level, 0.001, you know, like the 1 in 1,000 level, very, very loaded. Now you go along and you take the other population of people with temporal lobe disease. Do they have subjective paranormal experiences? And so this was a backward study, the other side of the coin, so to say, and some work done by my colleague Dr. John Palmer
Yes.
and myself on a population of neuropsychiatric patients. And wonder of wonders, we found the reverse, that these people have more subjective paranormal experiences.
Well, the key, it would seem to me, is the word you brought up earlier, veridicality. Otherwise, someone might say, well, you've just proven that subjective paranormal experiences are no more than something going on in the brain.
Exactly that. That key is very, very important. But the other key in relation to this is I kept emphasizing. I said, this data in no way proves that these experiences derive from within the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And it in no way proves that these experiences derive from outside the brain. All we know is the final common pathway, or a common pathway that we are analyzing, is the temporal lobe of the brain in terms of incoming polymodal perceptual input, which might be including subjective paranormal experiences. That's all we really know. We don't know which way round it is. Mm-hmm. And then there have to be other questions pertaining to which way round this is happening. And of course, a lot of it can come about by demonstrating hard line objectively. We can stimulate déjà vu in the brain, but sometimes we miss. And sometimes we get memory distortions. We can stimulate out-of-body experiences in the brain where the person literally thinks they're out of their body. But is that the same kind of experience? And so this is not only the veridicality component where you can prove it, but where you've got to phenomenologically analyze. Is that person experiencing being completely outside the brain? The localization, can they tell you what was happening in that operating room and from a different standpoint? Mm-hmm. Is it that just somehow their awareness, their consciousness was still inside the brain, but somehow they saw a double image? And we can't regard these as even. We can't regard them as alike. We've got to look at each one of these in detailed analysis, so that when we do detailed analyses, and it might not just be one person, it might be hundreds over a period of time, we will be able to ultimately say, like is important for like, and like is different from unlike. And this is a high relevance in terms of anything organic inside the brain, and a high relevance in terms of anything pertaining to the psi experiences, subjective paranormal experiences. These are the differences.
Dr. Vernon Neppe, thank you so much for sharing this half hour with me. I know we could keep going a long time. There's so much more to talk about and so much more research to do, but you've certainly been a pioneer in this important area.
Yeah, this has been an extremely fascinating and very, very important area. Major lesson. Again, we're dealing with subjectivity. I'm not saying these things do or don't exist. I've got to examine other areas of data to try and prove this. Or we all have to in the area of consciousness research, in an objective, skeptical way, but skeptical in the sense of I'm looking at science and looking at data, as opposed to the pseudo-skeptic who says, no, it doesn't exist, it's impossible. And we're not looking at that, although there is the term objective paranormal experience, and we can draw up criteria to objectify whether or not those with subjective paranormal experience demonstrably demonstrate more of these phenomena in a lab setting. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.